Hello, I'm Carol Carlton, head librarian at Southern West Virginia Community College and librarian here on the Williamson campus. I want to welcome you to our celebration of National Library Week. I see some faces from previous days, and if you were here, I think you can attest that we've had a really great week and promises to be the same today. Our speaker today is Dr. Otis K. Rice from West Virginia Institute of Technology. He is Professor Emeritus there, still teaching. I would like to get some general kinds of announcements out of the way here. First of all, the restrooms are outside the library there in the water fountain. This will last approximately 45 minutes, and we're allowing some time for Dr. Rice to answer questions if you have questions. And then if you had books of his that you would like to have him sign, I'm sure he will be glad to do so. He has been doing that. There is a reception afterwards with some cake and punch, and we invite you to stay. Now, we don't have anything scheduled for tomorrow, but Friday we do have David Phillips from Washington, D.C., who has written War Diaries, the 1861 Kanawha Valley campaigns. I just talked to Dave on the phone, and he works for the government, and he works in a very critical area, and he said his two office mates had just gotten their plane tickets out, and he could not divulge where, but he said he might have to go. But a few minutes ago when he called me, he said it's covered and he will be here. And he promised to tell us a little bit about what he does for the government, too. So that sounds kind of fascinating. And that's for Friday at 12:30. So we invite you to come back for that. Okay. Dr. Rice is a graduate of Morris Harvey College, which is now the University of Charleston. He's a graduate of the West Virginia University, where he got his master's in history and school administration. He got his PhD from the University of Kentucky in history. Prior to 1957, he was a teacher and principal in Kanawha County schools. From 1957 to the present, he has been at West Virginia Institute of Technology at Montgomery, West Virginia, serving in many capacities, from assistant professor to professor of history, chairman of the Department of History, concurrently director of the Division of Humanities and Sciences, dean of the School of Human Studies, professor emeritus since 1987. He has been visiting professor at Marshall University for 4 summers and at Morris Harvey. He has many, many publications. I'll list a few of them here. Most famous, of course, the Hatfields and the McCoys. He's also written The Allegheny Frontier, West Virginia Beginnings, West Virginia, the State and Its People, Frontier, Kentucky, Charleston and the Kanawha Valley, an Illustrated History, West Virginia, a History, the Lewisburg United Methodist Church, a Bicentennial History, the Sheltering Arms Hospital, Hansford, West Virginia, 1887 to 1923, which I heard him tell Fred Michael just a minute ago was the only hospital between Cincinnati and Richmond, Virginia for a long time. It has a fascinating history. He wrote the history of banking in West Virginia, the coal industry in the Kanawha Valley to 1861, Eli Thayer and the Friendly Invasion of Virginia, importations of cattle into Kentucky, West Virginia and the French and Indian War, West Virginia printers and their work. Has many major articles to his credit and has done many book reviews for other authors. And his professional activities are too numerous to mention. Many awards and honors. So we are really very honored today to have Dr. Rice to talk to us about the Hatfields and McCoys and how he did his research and what prompted him to get into that. So we welcome Dr. Rice.
You said about 45 minutes. I just asked Ms. Carlton to confirm the 45 minutes because I think some of you will know that college professors are usually programmed for at least 50-minute courses, and in some cases, at our school at least, if classes meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we are more or less programmed for an hour and 15 minutes. So I just want to be sure that I stay within my time limits. I'm very, very pleased to be here in Williamson today and to be with you and to be a part of your observance of the National Library Week. I first want to begin by telling you something of how I happened to do the little book on the Hatfields and the McCoys. Some of you may know that back during the 1970s, we began to plan in this country for the National Bicentennial in 1976, the Declaration of Independence having been signed 200 years previously. And the University of Kentucky received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for the use of their publications, for their division of publications, to produce a series of small books on various aspects of Kentucky history. And they called this a Kentucky bookshelf. Mr. Crouch, who was the associate editor of the press, used to say that some of you may remember that there was once a famous collection of books that many people knew about, Dr. Eliot's, the president of Harvard University's famous 5-foot shelf of books. And as Mr. Crouch said, the University of Kentucky wasn't going to try to compete with the 5-foot shelf, but they did hope to get a 2-foot shelf out of the humanities grant. And basically what they wanted to do was to produce a series of small books, somewhere around 100 or 100 plus pages, that would deal with some aspects of Kentucky history. And ultimately they did bring out a total of some 45 books on various subjects. But at any rate, he asked me if I would do one on frontier Kentucky. And I had done the Allegheny frontier, which focused on West Virginia, but it spilled over into areas like Kentucky, even western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, Tennessee, and so on. And so I felt, well, I at least have a bit of information to start with. And so I agreed to do the one on frontier Kentucky, which you just showed me you have, which incidentally has been out of print for some time too, so it's getting rather scarce. But at any rate, after I had finished that, he called me, Mr. Crouch called me one day, and he said, I wonder if you would do a book on the Wilderness Road to Kentucky, the road which was cut by Daniel Boone and others over into the central Kentucky area, and which many pioneers into Kentucky followed as they went west. Well, it seemed to me, from where I had been, that there had been a great deal done on the Wilderness Road, and I just was not sure that I could add very much to what other writers had already said in terms of getting new materials and so on. So I told him I would think about his offer for 2 or 3 days, and then I would call him back and tell him what I would be willing to do. The more I thought about it, the more sure I was in my own mind that I shouldn't be doing the Wilderness Road, and I questioned whether that should even be in the series, even though it's an important part of Kentucky history, but simply because it has been covered, I thought, fairly well. But I gave him a counter proposal because I had been interested in West Virginia history. I'm a native West Virginian, and I don't mind boasting a bit about it now and then. But at any rate, I told him I thought that the Hatfield and McCoy feud, even though that had been treated many, many times in book-length treatments and in articles and various other ways, that there needed to be probably some updating of information on the feud. And I gave him a few ideas that I had. He seemed to be very satisfied, and he said, I will call you back within about a week. Well, he called me back the next day, and he said, I have talked with the other people here at the University Press. They are very, very much in approval of the idea, and so get to work. And so that was the origin of this book. Now, one of the reasons I even suggested the Hatfields and McCoys as a subject for one of these little books in the bookshelf series was the fact that I had read several things. And to a certain degree, I was not satisfied with many of them. I felt that there were, in some cases, exaggerations or even misrepresentations, and sometimes gaps in the information that, if possible, needed to be filled or corrected, or at least amended. So I did just what Mr. Crouch said. I began to get busy. And as I began that study, I asked myself a few questions that I thought I would like to know the answers to, and perhaps other people might like to have the answers. Because in some cases, the questions had already been answered, but they'd been answered in several different ways by several different people. And so I thought, well, I'll see if I can resolve any of them. I may have resolved some, and I'm sure some of them I did not resolve, and I'm not sure whether they would ever be resolved or not. But at any rate, I went ahead and started out with one question first of all. What kind of people were these people, the Hatfields, the McCoys, and their friends and their neighbors, and so on? Well, as you probably know, and I suspect there are Hatfields here, or Hatfield relatives, and some McCoy relatives probably. But they were people like everybody else who came into the western parts of present West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, western Pennsylvania, and so on. Many of them were Scotch-Irish and people of British ancestry, but they were the same kinds of people who had come into many other areas. Originally, no different whatever. They were a part of a great migration that had come to America from the British Isles, and many of the people in that migration entered this country at Philadelphia. That was the port that drew them in far greater numbers than any other. And of course, once they got here, many were indentured servants in that first generation, worked for a period of time. Then they were on their own, and most of these people, you could almost say this with 100%, for 100% of the time. Most of the immigrants who came into this country in the 1700s wanted one thing above everything else, and that was land. In Europe, they had few opportunities to own land, but in America, it was plentiful, and most people had that ideal of having their own property, their own land, and the independence that went with it. And consequently, since land was scarce in eastern Pennsylvania where they had landed, they began to move out toward the frontiers. And as time passed, that frontier began to creep down through the Shenandoah Valley, and people began to move down through there into present West Virginia, into eastern Kentucky, some of them on down even into western North Carolina, such as the Boone family went on down to the North Carolina, Piedmont. But at any rate, the Hatfields and the McCoys were a part of that great migration, and so were most of the other older families here in this Tug River Valley. Now, they also, as a class of people, are what we would call yeoman stock. And that word yeoman, I think, has a very positive meaning and connotation. It refers to a person who is not in the aristocracy, but the person is also not what very often in the South was later called the poor whites. They were simply independent farmers who owned their own land and who had the outlook and the desires and the aspirations of the average American family. So these were perfectly average people in just about every way. Once they were settled here in the mountainous areas for a generation or two. Most of them were pretty isolated, and that doesn't take much of a imagination to understand that. Just for example, as I was driving down here, most of the time I was driving between the hills, as you do in so much of the Appalachian region. But most of these people lived by a combination of things: hunting, farming, timbering, and many of them made whiskey, all of it for medicinal purposes, I want to assure you, though. And of course, they felt that this was a perfectly honorable way of marketing corn. You could not transport corn miles and miles across a mountain on a wagon. It wouldn't last through the trip. But you could manufacture it into liquor, and there was a market for it, and in the eyes of people, many people, it was perfectly respectable. In 1794, the Western Pennsylvania farmers had a rebellion against the federal government simply because the government wanted to put a tax on whiskey, which they considered to be an unfair tax. But there was a variety of activities that coincided with the resources and the terrain and the needs of the region. Many of these people, as in other parts of the frontiers, whether you're in the Appalachian frontiers or whether you're on the plains, you go through the same experiences. But many of them had very little opportunity for education. Schools were few and far between in some cases. I think I have these statistics in the book, but in 1890, Logan County, which included this county at the time, had 44% of its children in school. That's children of school age. And if you take only the average daily attendance, only 24% of the children were in school on an average day. And I don't think that was terribly different from many other counties, because I gathered these statistics from reports of all the counties to the state superintendent. And much the same thing would have prevailed in Pike County, Kentucky. Schools were of very brief duration, 2 or 3 months a year, and as I said, they were rather scattered, so that educational opportunities were certainly limited. Church organizations were rather sparse also. In most of the mountainous regions of West Virginia, there were about 2 denominations that surpassed all of the others. Now, in West Virginia as a whole, the Methodists were the largest denomination among the frontiersmen. In certain parts, such as this, probably the Baptists were stronger. But many of the other denominations that were common then were very, very weak. You didn't find very many people in the Episcopal Church in West Virginia, except in the towns, the larger towns, or sometimes in the Eastern Panhandle. But the Baptist and the Methodist were the strongest of all. Another thing that went with this matter of isolation was that families tended to be close. There was a certain degree of clannishness about families, and they stuck together. If one member of the family were offended, there probably was an offense to many of them. And consequently, I think that has something to do with the causes of the war, or with the nature of the people, and helps maybe to explain the conflict. One of the common things that I ran into, and I'm sure if you've read very much on the Hatfields and the McCoys, and you've heard this too very often probably, that the feud began during the Civil War, in that one family was on one side and the other family was on the other side, so that they fought each other. And that is not really true. Both the Hatfields and the McCoys were largely Confederate when the war came. There was one member of the McCoy family, Harmon McCoy, and if you've read the book, or most other books, you'll know this story. But Harmon waited for a while and finally became a Unionist. And even his own family generally much regretted that. And when Harmon was ultimately killed, they did not raise too much of a furor about it. But they generally agreed basically in their principles. So I think the war had maybe something to do with this in setting a certain scene, but I don't think that the cause of the feud grew out of any situation where one family was on one side and the others were fighting opposite them. But after the war was over, I looked through the Pike County records, and in the University of Kentucky Library, there is a large collection of records of Pike County. And I think you could infer some of what I found there to be true, say, maybe of Logan County. But in those Pike County records, which incidentally were on the verge of all being destroyed because they were looked upon as old and now useless and not in such good shape, and Dr. Thomas Clark, who at one time was the head of the history department at the University of Kentucky, found out about that, called the people who were going to get rid of the records and sent trucks from Lexington up to Pike County and brought them all down to Kentucky. But I was getting ready to go to Pike County to look through their records one day, and I happened to run into Dr. Clark down at the University of Kentucky Library. So we were talking about what I was doing. I said, I'm going to plan to go to Pike County very soon and to look into their records. And then he nearly floored me because he said, you don't have to go to Pike County. They're right here in this building. So that made it easy for that particular set of records, at least. But in looking through some of those records, there are a great many suits brought by people who claim that during the war some group had come by, maybe taken some hogs supposedly for the Confederate Army, or taken a horse, simply impressed those things, and taken property. And now after the war was over, they were bringing suit to try to get judgment against the people who had made these moves. And there's a great deal of that. And you find the names Hatfield and McCoy and most of the other names, common names of families in the region, in those suits. So that there probably, it seems to me, was some residue of I wouldn't want to say hate, I don't think it was that, but of something about the war that at least made them feel that somebody had wronged them. They felt as if they had been wronged, and the courts were slow to act. These things dragged on and on and on, and sometimes I don't know whether they were ever fully resolved. But nevertheless, there was a feeling of wrong that had not been corrected by the authorities. So if the war had something to do with it, I think maybe it came out of some of those feelings that developed. Now, you know, I'm sure, there are those who maintain that the thing that brought about the feud was the fact that there was an argument over the ownership of a hog, in which Randolph-McCoy maintained that Floyd Hatfield had branded, and that meaning almost stolen, one of Randolph-McCoy's hogs. And that was considered a serious offense, to brand somebody else's animals or to alter a brand. And as you know, that matter finally came to a trial with Deacon Hatfield, as he was known, supposed to resolve the issue. And he, not being probably wanting to be right squarely in the middle of the two sides, arranged for a jury, and arranged for the jury to be about half and half, Hatfields and McCoys, or their friends. And there were one or two of the supposed McCoys who sided with the Hatfields, and that created some bad feelings within the two groups. But at any rate, that probably was not settled to everyone's satisfaction, and it undoubtedly had something to do with creating some harsh feelings, some ill will. Now, I was just about to say students because I'll do that so frequently when I'm talking to my classes, but I better not say that. But I don't know, but it seems to me I grew up in a small town back in the 30s, and at that time, and I still live there, incidentally. It's not the same place. It's changed like every place else has changed. But at that time, there were 2 or 3 families who had been living in that neighborhood for 2 or 3 generations at least. One of them, both of these families came in right after the Civil War. And then and practically everybody in that little hollow lot was related to one of the 2 families. We weren't. We were outsiders and a few others. But I do remember the old man who was the grandfather of the children I played with. I called him Grandpa too, because that was just the thing to do. But at any rate, my point is this: the 2 families never had a feud or anything of that sort, but they didn't have a thing to do with each other, these 2 larger extended families. I have no idea of what might ever have caused any trouble between them, if there was one, but somewhere they simply did not mingle to any great extent. I don't remember that there was ever a marriage between the 2 families, and many of them still live right there yet. Now, that in later years that's changed, but during the earlier years, they simply, for some reason, and maybe some small offense or something, but they had nothing much to do with each other. And I think that's very often true in rural, isolated areas, and we were sort of isolated then. But at any rate, maybe the hog problem did have something to do with causing the feud. But anyhow, things went on for several years until you had an election on Blackberry Creek, and the people all around would go to the election, because an election in those days was a great social occasion, as well as an occasion to discharge political responsibilities. But the West Virginia Hatfields would go over to Kentucky to Blackberry Creek and attend the elections. And I suspect it was worked both ways. But at any rate, in that election on Blackberry Creek in 1880, there came out of that election a situation that involved John Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy. And there's been a great, great deal written about that romance, and a great deal is awfully difficult to substantiate and to document. But some writers, and especially I think those who like to romanticize the whole thing, make a great point of the romance between Johns and Rosanna. But it's very difficult to get at facts. And I know, for example, and I do mention this in the book, the materials that I looked at, there's a question, for example, did Rosanna have a child? And I got 3 answers. One answer was yes, she did. It was a boy named Melvin. Another answer was yes, she did have a child. It was a daughter, however, and a name. And then the third one was no, she did not have a child. She had a miscarriage. Now that should be, you'd think, a very easy thing to substantiate, and yet to this day there's still that division of opinion from even within the families. Then you had the election of 1882, when there was the problem between the McCoys and the Hatfields, Ellis and Hatfield, and Talbert McCoy in an argument.